What? Mark down. March. Go. Hold. Right. Face. Hold. Left. Face. Hold. March.
Good afternoon. My name is Joe Geiger. I'm the Director of Archives and History, and we're awfully glad that you're here today for a very special event. We have been, Archives and staff has been responsible for doing the research resulting in the 11,427 names on the Veterans Memorial, honoring those men and women who lost their lives during 20th century periods of conflict. We've kept up the database, but we were very fortunate when Pat McClure, who is a retired West Virginia state English professor, began volunteering here at the archives. And she began writing biographies, and she also began working with classes, particularly classes from George Washington High School. And we're very thankful for the work that she has done with them. I think it's so important for young people to understand the sacrifices of those men and women from West Virginia, and we're thankful for Pat's work in working with them. So I'm just going to introduce Pat McClure and turn the program over to her. Again, thank you to you in attendance. Thank you to the students. Thank you to the parents and the teachers who worked with them. We're very thankful to have those biographies that we can then have on our website for others to share. Pat?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our program. Before we begin with the student biographers, I'd like to share with you some of the history of our biography project. And I'd like to start with a story. I think I'd like to read it because I said it in my words in the writing the way I want it to be said. About 4 years ago, I collaborated with a young man from the Netherlands who had adopted the grave of a World War II casualty in the Netherlands American Cemetery at Margraten. Martin Vossen had begun to research his soldier at the age of 13, and that search eventually led him to hire a filmmaker to tell the story of James Wickline from Morgantown. I helped him identify some grant funding from the West Virginia Humanities Council, and we worked together doing further research. The work culminated in not only a biography for our website, but in a film called Ageless Friends. And you can see this sometimes on PBS, on the West Virginia PBS. But that's not the end of the story. Several weeks ago, Martin came to Morgantown to celebrate the 100th birthday of a friend of James Wickline, whom he had met during the interview and filming process. Then he came to Charleston, which he had never visited, and got to see our West Virginia Veterans Memorial. While here, he told how he had recently visited a school classroom where the kids, and I think this was an elementary classroom, the kids had adopted another veteran, Monzel Barker, who just happened to be from West Virginia. Now, it's not clear to me whether this was a coincidence or if they chose this veteran because they knew that Martin was coming to their school and had also adopted a West Virginian's grave. But they used our biography to learn more about their soldier. But that's not the end of the story. Monzel Barker's bio was written by one of our student biographers, not me. And I still had an email address from him, and I wrote to tell him that his biography was being used by the students in the Netherlands. The student returned my email saying that he's now a senior at WVU. He's majoring in history and political science, and the work he did writing biographies for the archives was one factor in his deciding on what his future career would be. And that's not the end of the story, because I heard from Martin this week, and the elementary students are doing further research into the life of Monzel Barker because they think there's more to be found. He was the oldest of 11 children, and none of them are living, so they haven't been able to find any surviving family members. But the Netherlands kids are corresponding with people in Philippi and in Elkins to learn more about the soldier whose grave they adopted. So I think that's a pretty cool success story in itself. This crop of biographies that we got from last year's junior ROTC program at GW did reach some milestones. We've been able to write the biographies of all the people in the conflicts beyond Vietnam, and by that I mean Panama and the Gulf Wars. We have all those covered now. We've also covered the biographies of all the West Virginia Medal of Honor casualties, I think. Now, there are, I think, some under further consideration. So that will be an ongoing project. The project started with an advanced placement history teacher at George Washington asking me if her students could write biographies that would help them understand the World War II era. And then the ROTC got involved as well. There are three principles that I stress with the students, and one of them, of course, is the accuracy of factual information. They have to do the research and they have to get it right. And they have me looking over their shoulder, and they have Sergeant Norman, you'll meet him later on, and Major McGee at GW, the two instructors of the program. And so they have to pass muster with us. They also need to be sensitive to the wishes of the family. In many cases, we aren't able to find family members of the veterans who are listed on our memorial. But we always act as though they're looking over our shoulders when we're doing the writing as well. And the third principle I ask them to follow is say something about your veteran that brings that veteran to life. Make your story interesting, because all of these are very interesting people and each one of them has a unique story. We really are trying to find out the background of them. There are three main sections to each biography. We start with personal information, then they write about context. And if they can't find a lot of personal information, they can sometimes tell what the person was like by looking at the community in which their veteran grew up. And finally, they must do some research on the military history of their veteran. Okay, I'm going to briefly go through all the biographies that were written by the JROTC last year. But some of them we will pause and let students tell about their stories. The first one, and they're in alphabetical order, is Paul Eugene Bays. He was from Taylor County, and he had one sibling named Nancy. He was a member of the U.S. Army Support Command, and their job is to maintain and repair cargo and assault helicopters. His unit was in a billet that was bombed by a Viet Cong suicide bomber in 1965. Ted Belcher, if you look at the dates of his life, he was involved in the military over a long span of time. I usually think that people in the 1940s, who grew up in the 1940s and 50s, my generation, were the Vietnam casualties, but Ted Belcher goes back, his military history goes back a lot farther than that. He was one of eight family members. He had 7 siblings. And there's a bridge on Corridor G in Logan County named for him. A lot of our veterans do have, in West Virginia, a bridge named for them or a section of a highway named for them, and he is one of those. He is a Medal of Honor winner, and I'd like to read to you something from his Medal of Honor citation. He met heavy and accurate automatic weapons and sniper fire. And as he moved up with his men, a hand grenade landed in the midst of the sergeant's squad. Instantly realizing the immediate danger to his men, Sergeant Belcher unhesitatingly and with complete disregard for his safety lunged to his men. He lunged forward, covering the grenade with his body. Absorbing the grenade blast at the cost of his life, he saved his comrades from becoming casualties. Sergeant Belcher's profound concern for his fellow soldiers at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Army and reflect credit upon himself and the armed forces of his country. Jackie Boland from Raleigh County had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and he was killed in the Battle of Ong Thom in 1967. His sister had this to say about her brother, his sister Sherry. First Lieutenant Clark Welch, your commanding officer, has told me that you are a great soldier, and your friends, they have all spoken so highly of you and told me what a great person and soldier you were. We will never forget you, Jackie. Okay. Ted Christian, the reason I put his slide in here was we already had a short biography of Ted Christian when Dr. Ken Bailey, who used to be with West Virginia Tech, approached me and said he had some additional information he'd like to share with me about Ted Christian. And most of the information he passed on to me was about Ted Christian's, not his academic prowess so much as his sports prowess. He was a football player. And I thought, well, this is the kind of thing that I emphasize when I say, bring your soldier to life. And so he shared lots of articles from local newspapers about Ted Christian's athletic career at West Virginia Tech. But before he left for a military service, Teddy was also involved in community service. His obituary points to the fact that he was a member of the Lions Club, and after his passing, the first Gauley Bridge VFW organization was created and named the Ted Christian Post 8366. Thus, Ted Christian left a legacy not often associated with a 23-year-old. Virginia? Virginia Cook was one of the biographers of Robert Clark.
Robert Arthur Clark was the second of the biographies that I've worked on. I'm currently working on a third. And last year we researched him, and while it's more difficult to find information because so much of it has been lost with time, there was a few things we were able to find out about him, and just through this process, it's been not only a benefit to me, but I also like to think that it just honors our veterans to think that they're not forgotten. Was there anything else you wanted me to talk about? Okay, thank you. Okay.
Oh, Sophia. By the way, the reason the whole class isn't here is these were biographies done last year, and that there isn't a one-to-one relationship of members of last year's class and this year's class. Plus, the soccer team is in Beckley playing as we speak, right? Okay.
So Julius Cartwright Foster came from Welch. He lived in a 4-generation household where him, his siblings, his parents, his grandparents, and his great-grandfather lived together. but he never complained. He was voted, I think, funniest or something like that in his class. He always made people happy. And he signed into the reserves with the Marine Corps after high school, but he attended West Virginia University. And afterwards, he decided that he wanted to raise awareness for the people who were sacrificing their lives in the name of democracy for the people in Vietnam. So he decided to re-enlist rather than become an officer, and he took a 400-mile month-long journey from his home in Welch to Camp Lejeune and went into the infantry, and he sacrificed his life for not only his country but for another.
Now, obviously, John William Garrett was not one of our Vietnam veterans. He was actually, you can see by the date, in the Gulf War period. On April 14, 1994, Garrett was serving as a pilot of one of two UH-60 Blackhawks on a UN humanitarian relief operation for the Kurdish minority in northern Iraq. Multiple no-fly zones had been enacted by the UN as a result of the Persian Gulf War, and as they entered a no-fly zone over northern Iraq, the Black Hawk's identification friend or foe system failed. Two American fighter jets patrolling the area mistook the UH-60s for Iraqi Hinds. The Black Hawks were both shot down, killing CW2 Garrett and 25 other people on board. His body was returned to the United States, and he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. And there's his headstone in Arlington. Robert Willard Hartsock was born in Maryland and briefly worked for the B&O Railroad. He had one brother and a sister. His sister only lived for 3 months. He is another of our Medal of Honor winners, and his occupation is somewhat unique. I didn't really understand the role of dog trainers and handlers in the military, but I'm assuming they sniff out bombs and those kinds of things. From his Medal of Honor citation, I'd like to read a little bit. As a wounded enemy soldier fell, he managed to detonate a satchel charge he was carrying. Staff Sergeant Hartsock, with complete disregard for his own life, threw himself on the charge and was gravely wounded. In spite of his wounds, Staff Sergeant Hartsock crawled about 5 meters to a ditch and provided heavy suppressive fire, completely pinning down the enemy and allowing his commander to seek shelter. Staff Sergeant Hartsock continued his deadly stream of fire until he succumbed to his wounds. And there's Robert Hartsock with one of the dogs he has trained. You'll probably notice that the photographs that accompany the slides are, some of them are pretty decent photographs and others are not very good resolution. We do have a source called the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund that has, they say they have all the West Virginia casualties photographs on their site, but I have found a few that aren't there. So we're really grateful that they've been sharing those in our biographies. Carmel Harvey was one of 2 children. He had a younger brother, Clyde, and he also is the Medal of Honor winner. And notice that when his family moved to Chicago, he attended George Washington High School there. That's sort of ironic. From his Medal of Honor citation. Realizing the danger to his comrades if he remained, and despite the hail of enemy fire, he jumped to his feet shouted a challenge at the enemy, and raced toward the deadly machine gun. He nearly reached the enemy position when the grenade on his belt exploded, mortally wounded Specialist 4C Harvey and stunning the enemy machine gun crew. His final act caused a pause in the enemy fire, and the wounded men were moved from the danger area. That's a pretty common story among these Medal of Honor winners. Roy Dwight Heaster was from Greenbrier County, and he had two older brothers. One was Franklin Delano, and one was Patrick Jesse Law Heaster. You can sort of tell what era they were from because his brother was named Franklin Delano. Oh, Sergeant Norman.
So when I was looking up more information about Joseph Gordon Keim, we of course, didn't have a lot of resources to work with. So Ancestry.com did a lot of help for us, and there's a lot of other sites along with that kind of link together. And I happened to narrow down through some vital records some of his brothers and sisters who happened to live in the Charlestown area. And it was hard to try to get any addresses because they had actually, some had moved to Martinsville, and some had moved back to North Carolina. And he actually went to school all the way up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and graduated because his father was actually a member of the railroad system, so they kind of moved around a lot then. So, of course, being in the military, we're used to moving around a lot. Was in the Marines at first, and then he joined up with the Army Reserves, and then was deployed to the Gulf War. And this was kind of dear to me because my brother actually was deployed to the Gulf War back in the 90s. And I was trying to see if there was any lineage there because my brother was in the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. But, and of course, he died from a roadside bomb and died a couple of days after his injuries. So I actually did get a hold of someone trying to get the information. He was his oldest brother, and he gave me the best information that he could. He didn't have any actual official military records to give me to find out what awards he had. But of course, we try to do the best we can for the families to put down as much as we can and to have them published for them for anyone to look up and learn about the history of our fine men and women who've served our country here. Okay?
And there's his headstone in Arlington. Okay, Major McGee is not able to be with us because he's coaching the soccer team today, but this is his biography, and I must commend the two leaders of the JROTC at GW. They don't ask their students to do anything that they wouldn't do themselves. And so not only have their students written some fine biographies, but they've jumped right in and written some biographies as well. Reuben Kirk, and by the way, this is the correct spelling of his name. There are a couple here that I'll point out to you that we tried. That's the accuracy part that I talked about. His name is Rueben, and he graduated from Tulsa High School, and he was very active when he was in high school. He went into the military. I'm guessing he went into the military because he knew that when he came out he would have educational benefits, because he wanted to become a teacher, and he specifically wanted to become a physics teacher. But he married young. He was actually only 19, I believe, when he was killed. So I would like to read something to you directly from Major McGee's biography of him. Under a picture of the dedication stone for Gulf War veterans at Arlington National Cemetery, the 7 Corps Desert Storm Veterans Association has written, "We won't forget, ever." That picture and caption has been the cover for every memorial service conducted in the remembrance of the 7 Corps soldiers who died in the service of our nation. That little phrase, "we won't forget, ever," is not a statement of fact or of history. It is a statement of their mission. Remembering these heroes proved in liberating strife is part of what unites the 7 Corps Desert Storm Veterans Association. In a very real way, we dedicate what we do to them. May remembering them by name inspire us all to honor them by what we do together. Major McGee was able, at the very last minute when he was writing the biography, to get in touch with Reuben Kirk's widow, who has since remarried. And she put together this collage, some really nice pictures that we have on the website. Victor Lake was one of 2 children. His brother is named Vincent. We think he's still living and quite possibly living in Texas, but we haven't been able to get in touch with him. If we do locate him and we get more information, we will revise the biography and put some more things up about him. He entered the Marine Corps soon after graduating from high school, and he was part of Operation Desert Storm, which you probably know is the name for the first Gulf War. I did correspond briefly with one of his comrades in arms, Teddy Butinas, who said, "I was with him when he was killed, and I think about him often." And Teddy sent us some additional pictures that we have on the website of Victor Lake. Christopher Lester, again, is not a Vietnam casualty. He was actually killed in an attack on the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. He had a sister named Jessica and a brother Cecil, and he grew up in Pineville in Wyoming County, graduated from Pineville High School. He was headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but he actually volunteered to go to the Middle East. And he was killed when terrorists drove a tanker with 2.5 tons of explosives into the perimeter of Khobar Towers, and you can see why nobody survived that. Okay, here's another one, and you can't dispute the spelling of his name. It's a double L. I knew I had heard of him when we started doing the biographies, and that's because there is a bridge in Raleigh County that's named for him, and I guess I must have crossed over that bridge several times because I remember seeing P-H-I-L-L on that bridge, and it stuck in my mind, and then we started researching him, and we found that he was an actual Medal of Honor winner. He was one of 12 children, and he had a twin sister named Phyllis. From his Medal of Honor citation, he volunteered to escort 2 wounded comrades to an evacuation point, and doing so, he crawled through intense fire to destroy with a grenade an enemy automatic weapon. Despite his painful wounds as a result of this, Private First Class McDonald recovered the weapon of a wounded machine gunner to provide accurate covering fire for the gunner's evacuation. When other soldiers were pinned down by heavy volume of fire from a hostile machine gun to his front, Private First Class McDonald crawled toward the enemy position to destroy it with grenades. He was mortally wounded in this intrepid action. And there's the view of the bridge. That's a beautiful view, but it's actually on the interstate. So you get a different perspective when you're driving the interstate. Dawson Henderson was one of the biographers of Stephen Mulholland.
Stephen was born in Webster County, married to Goldie, who who was dead around the same time he was. It never told us why. He had 3 children: Steve, who was named after him, Jeff, and Susan. Two of them are still alive, and I think Steve is the one that is no longer with us. He died by small arms fire, which is the sad part about this, because I looked everywhere and could not find what exactly took him. And he was one of 4 kids, and served in the light weapons infantry. And there is a book here in the archives called The Banks of the Holly that has history of him and his family.
Archie Andrew Porter is another one whose some of the facts of his life are rather elusive, and we'd like to find out more about him. It appears that his wife was a German national, and she moved back to Germany after his death, so it has been difficult to get any contact with him. He came from Marshall County originally, and you can see by the date that he is one of our Vietnam casualties. He's actually buried in Roanoke, Virginia, and again, we're not sure why he's there, but as we say, military families do move around a lot. Now we're coming to a very special part of the program. This is something that hasn't happened in some of the previous programs we've had. But we have a family member of Joe Harold Pringle here. Lieutenant Colonel Fred Pringle, his son, is with us. And I'd like to yield the floor to him and just let him tell us what he wants to about his father.
I would like to thank you from the family for honoring my father. Unlike the other individuals you'll hear about, which were killed in action, my father was missing in action. So, unfortunately, Veterans Day, Memorial Day doesn't really apply, because actually another 10 years he was listed missing in action before they presumed him dead. And if in the history books, you'll hear about the veterans that come back, number that are killed, but you never hear about those that are missing. To give you an idea, from the Vietnam War alone, as of yesterday, there's still 1,587 soldiers missing in action and unaccounted for. My dad's still one of them. And in this quarter of the fiscal year, they have the DOD, the Defense, POW, MIA, accounting agency, has a team looking at various sites to try to locate his crash site. To give you an overall idea, there's 81,962 unaccounted service members going back to World War II that the DOD, which is tasked with this, the DPAA, are looking for. Little story of the photo there. When my dad was alerted to Vietnam in either late 66, early 67, we were stationed at Camp Drum, New York, and had the option of family could stay where we were stationed at, which at that time was a National Guard and Reserve training base with 93 full-time service members, or could be relocated because he was also assigned to go to aviation maintenance school to learn to fly Hueys, or actually maintain Hueys. So the decision was made that he would relocate us. That's why we're from Columbus, Ohio. My mother was born in Newark, which is half hour east, and basically grew up in Columbus. That's where they met. He was the motor sergeant at the recruiting station at then Fort Hays. Fort Hays now is sort of a special high school, but it was a military installation that goes back to the Civil War that was an arsenal. And that's where my grandmother was. So my mom was the only child. At that time, there was no family support type mechanisms that they have today. So it just happened that she lived in a 4-unit townhouse, and the end unit next to hers was available, and my dad moved us in there, and then on off to Fort Rucker, Alabama for schooling. Just before my 5th birthday, he graduated, came back, and took some leave before he left for Vietnam. My mom knew that he was going to Fort Hays to do some business. So for those that have been around a while and know what I mean by Olin Mills, she scheduled an appointment, and this was the last photos taken of him before he left for Vietnam. My memories of him are very limited. I can remember at Camp Drum, being that he was from the hollers of West Virginia, taking me hunting. I think I may have been 4 years old. I was given a stick, and I kept falling in half-filled in foxholes because hunting was in the training area. I can remember him, before he left a 2-minute audio, and for the 50th anniversary, I made copies of it and gave it out to the families because that's the last of his voice that we have of him. Probably, and I remember, is when we took him to Port Columbus, which is now John Glenn International Airport, to see him off to SeaTac, where he processed through Fort Lewis, Washington. He walked towards the entranceway and then stopped, and Mom took me and my younger brother, because he's 18 months younger, to then the observation deck, which was the roof of the airport, so that then we could watch him, walk across the tarmac and up the stairs and board the aircraft, which he waved at us and we waved at him. That was the last time I saw him, and I was 5 years old, and I hadn't even started kindergarten. So, but what I can encompass on him is that he was something greater than himself. If you read his biography, he only made it to the 9th grade, and the first 8 grades were in a 1-room schoolhouse. And I found out why they called it White School, because it was the first schoolhouse painted white in that area. Prior to that, it was, from what I read, was a log cabin built prior to the Civil War was their school. And I think your mom went there, because I know Aunt Linda told me that she remembers walking to that school. He started at the end of World War II. He quit school, worked on the family farm, and then after he turned 17, joined the Army in 1946. And first assignment was the occupied area of Korea. And there's sort of something funny about that. When my great aunt passed away at the age of 90, I got some of the stuff related to my dad. And in it was a letter to my great uncle just prior to his graduation from Fort Knox of how he's having a ball driving tanks and making fun of the folks that are going to Camp Stoneman because they were headed overseas. And at the time, he was supposed to go to, I think, Fort Benning to airborne school. Unfortunately, that didn't happen the way he planned it, and so he was reassigned to go to Camp Stoneman and ended up in Korea. So be careful what you wish for or not wish for in life. many years later, my mom gave me my dad's textbooks from aviation maintenance school. For a person that only had a 9th grade education, most of it in a one-room schoolhouse, learned physics and calculus. He was also an honor graduate from his class. So once he was in Vietnam, unbeknownst to us, well, part of it we know, that the pilots taught him how to fly. And to our understanding, because he was a motor sergeant, and anybody that works in maintenance, is that once you repair the piece of equipment, you test drive it before you put it back online. And that was my mom's understanding from what he, we'll just say, presented to her. But he, he flew Hueys. And all of his photos are from the co-pilot seat with no door, looking out either forward or out his door that he took. And in the biography, there is a picture of him at his LZ. And that one of the things that they would do he would take pictures, send the film home. My mom would develop them, send them back to Vietnam for him to label what each of these were. And the one that's in his biography of him standing by his tent was, to her, is like, if you forget what I look like, here I am. Unfortunately, he was on a maintenance mission, and when his helicopter, with 4 other individuals, lost radar and radio contact and became missing in action. Approximately 3 months later, a Vietnamese woodcutter ran across the crash site and reported it to the Marine outpost at the base. They sent a recovery team. Unfortunately, back in the 60s, they did not have what they have today with DNA and such, and there was no accountability to the extent that they have today. They took 5 sandbags, whatever bone fragments that they could find. They divvied up between the 5. The only thing identifiable was 1 dog tag, not a pair, but 1 out of all 5 people, and it was my dad's. And then that was it. Since then, they've not been able to find that same site again, now that they have the technology. Approximately 10 years later, in 1978, there was a big push to make a decision, and at that time, there were approximately 2,500 missing in action from Vietnam. And my dad was one of the last later ones. So in October of 78, his status was changed from missing in action to presumptive death, remains not recovered. So his headstone actually has 1978 based on his legal death date. Shortly after that, our Family Survivors Assistance Officer had asked us, did we want his medals sent to us or have a presentation, because we lived in Columbus and they have the depot, or now it's DSCC, and it was like, we'll have it presented. Thought it was a little thing. My dad's career going back to 1946, thought we would just have whatever medals that he had earned. Well, that was what was in the box, but they had a formal presentation. He was awarded the Bronze Star, and as his eldest son there, I accepted it on his behalf. And then he was also awarded the 2nd through the 7th Air Medal, which is only given under combat conditions. And my younger brother accepted that on his behalf. And that's one of the things I saw my mom chewing one of the first times was her thought was he was only flying maintenance missions, not he was flying combat missions, because on the citation said over 25 aerial combat missions. But I could tell from reading some of the letters that she had kept that, he had flown a lot, because there was, in one of them was he wasn't sure if he was going to get his flight paid for that month because he didn't do enough time, but he had flown enough time that it covered the whole year. So she was a little bit that he wasn't forthcoming that he was flying combat missions. And with this project, I went through his records. Being that he was missing, in the summers I would go to Washington, D.C. and get an update on this case. And prior to the bringing the reserve and the active duty personnel offices together, consolidating, they used to have it at Alexandria, Virginia for the active duty, and would bring his physical records, original documents going back to 1946 to the meeting. I had 30 minutes to look at those and then talk to an analyst. And his records, there were like 3 folders each in an accordion folder, and there were about 2 of those. And so there would be a fraction of the time. In the process, I found the actual original write-up for that citation, which had over 150 aerial combat missions. So if you look at the timeline that he was in Vietnam from July 1967 till he went down, that was nearly 1 combat mission a day, if not multiples in some days. So I look at this as being one of those, he was something greater than himself, because here he was just a maintenance sergeant. He didn't have to, learn to fly, which he did. He didn't have to do combat missions. But I look at it as how many other Vietnam veterans made it home because he stepped up to the plate when he was needed and took this task on. This is summer, and I think that sort of solidified that he was something greater than himself. I took my girlfriend to Washington, D.C. with me for, the update, so she understands why 1 week, every time in June that I take off to D.C. and, what it, as a family member we go through. The one evening before we left, they always take time for those that are, having to travel and take an evening trip to the wall so that the family members can see their loved ones. And we went and I took her there in the evening. There was a Vietnamese family, a young one, that volunteers there at the wall, whether they need a ladder to help get a copy of their name. And, I just sort of had solemn time next to my dad, because he's sort of almost near the bottom, so I can sit down and, next to it. Well, when I was done, I stood up, and the young lady came over and thanked me for my family's sacrifices. Because if it wasn't for his sacrifices, that his parents and grandparents wouldn't have been able to come to America and give them, the young lady, a better life. So, this was, definitely that he was something greater than himself. And hopefully someday I can be that way too. That's all I have.
Thank you so much. And you'll notice that Mr. Pringle's service spanned a long period of time, several conflicts, and then we're right back with one of the very young ones who lost his life. Lloyd Eugene Robinson had 6 brothers and 4 sisters. You'll notice many of these West Virginia veterans did come from large families, and that would have been one reason for their entering the service when they did. He did go to Lewis County High School, and he was an active student there, but he was only 21 years old when he lost his life at Ben Din. And here's another one that has a bridge named for him. So we are honoring our veterans in many different ways in West Virginia. And Luke is here to tell us about Kenneth Douglas Scott.
So Kenneth Douglas Scott, born in Princeton, he has a special story behind him. So he grew up during the era of the civil rights, and his home life was not very well. He was abused as a child, and he had 5 brothers and a sister. And basically, from what his sister quoted for him was, the Army was the easy way to get out of his home life, and that is why he joined the Army. He was in the Panama conflict when he enlisted. He went into the Panama conflict in 1989 during Operation Just Cause. He was killed at age 20 conducting a roadblock out of the city by a small arms fire, and he is buried in Roselawn Memorial Gardens in Princeton.
And there's a map of Operation Just Cause. Robert Dewey Thompson enlisted in 1966, which was the height of the Vietnam War. And he's from Pendleton County and later moved to Lewis County. And he's buried in Elkins, so he's basically a West Virginian through and through. And for him, there's a bridge on US 33. It's about 10 miles from Elkins. It crosses the Cheat River, and it's named for him. And I think I missed this one. Robert Lee Smith, typical 20-something who was killed in Vietnam. And as with many of, we haven't mentioned the medals that some of these men earned, but like many of them, he did win a number of medals, including the Combat Infantry Badge, the National Defense Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal, the Vietnam Campaign Medal, and of course, the Purple Heart. And if you want to read biographies of additional service members, of casualties, we wish we had all 11,000 plus up on the website, but we're getting a number up, and it's a worthwhile project. If anybody has information on a casualty of 20th century conflicts in West Virginia, please contact Archives with your information. We'd like for you to write the biography, but if you don't want to write the biography, give us the information and we'll get it written here, because this is a very worthwhile project. And it's what I spend my time doing because it's something I can do. Thank you all for coming, and especially thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Pringle for coming down from the Columbus area and sharing the stories. I wish we had that amount of detail on all of our veterans so that we could bring them back to life.
Go. Vote. Mark. Mark time. Mark. Go. Vote. Post. Retire. Go. Forward. Mark. Go. Hold. Forward. Go. Forward.
Do you know how many West Virginians have won the Medal of Honor?
Again, it's a privilege for our students to be able to write these biographies. We always teach our motto in JROTC is to help students become better citizens. And with all the community service events that we do, outreach to veterans, with the VFW, which we don't have a lot of our students here today because we're having the VFW at Walmart with their Poppy Drive. So I have about 25 students out there. So we have about 102 in the total program. So, and the soccer game today too. Hopefully GW wins again. So to have so many students like, yes, I want to give my time, I want to do this. It's empowering to our program, to our school to have so much dedication from these kids to do that. It's a leadership course of a teacher. So they're owning up and they're like, yes, I want to take more of this on. And so I'm blessed to have this job, have such fascinating students who are willing to give their time and do these things. And what we write about, they learn a lot from it, and it helps shape them for what they're going to do maybe later in life. Knowing what people have done in the past, for them to be where they are right now, and to cherish that and to move forward in that honor. So I'm going to do more for my community because others have done this for me. I'm going to do this in my future. So thank you again for coming out so much.
Your question, there's a bronze marker.
I guess that's it.
Sorry,
Sorry to hold you.
yeah, some of them are just the expensive.
Yeah.